Well, they turned Daniel from a beautiful, bright-eyed little boy into a bag of bones. They basically broke him in so many ways. The words of a senior officer responsible for the investigation into 4-year-old Daniel Pelka's death. Today, the Deputy Prime Minister said the horrific catalogue of abuse should be on everyone's conscience. This was a little boy who went to school, after all, even as he was being starved, force-fed salt, beaten, held underwater in his bath and locked in a cold, empty room for days on end. Tonight, Newsnight talks to a man who advises the government where the failures in our social care system lie, the system that's supposed to protect the most vulnerable children. And his prognosis is worrying indeed. Zoe Conway has this report.
He was starved, he was beaten on a regular basis, he was imprisoned in a box room, he was drowned to a point of unconsciousness on occasion, and also he was poisoned with salt. So yes, an absolutely wretched existence for this little boy.
There's no shortage of horrifying descriptions of Daniel Pelka's suffering, or of disbelief that so many opportunities were missed to intervene. In the 14 months before his death, there were visits to his home by social workers, health workers and teachers. There was a police investigation, and just 3 weeks before he died, he was examined by a paediatrician.
Who I think was 1.5 stone.
1 stone 3.
Today began a search for answers and the inevitable finger-pointing.
I think his death should be on all of our consciences, and I just think we've...
But you're in a unique position, Mr. Day. You're deputy. What should the government be doing?
Well, what we have done already is get rid of a lot of the complexity and bureaucracy that we worry might have meant that cases were not picked up earlier.
Everybody knew. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody felt they were directly responsible for it, and that it was their job that they were paid for to put it right, to do something about it. That's what went wrong.
Coventry's Child Services Department is now subject to an official review for its handling of this case, but it's not alone in facing scrutiny. According to Ofsted, 1 in 4 of the country's child protection units are failing. Ray Jones is the man Ofsted sends in to work with councils struggling to cope. He can see how social workers in Coventry might have missed things.
This is my concern, that people don't have the time at the moment to find out what they need to find out. We don't get to know what we need to know. People are rushing from case to case, family to family, child to child, trying to close the ones down that we think, well, maybe that's okay, although we're not totally sure, but we can't stick with it because we've got to make space to deal with these new ones coming into us as referrals, as new notifications. So, yes, with what we know now, people would have clearly done different things. But it's understandable for me, in terms of the pressure the system's under, why people don't necessarily know what they need to know.
In the last 5 years, the number of children in the child protection system has increased. Child protection orders have gone up by 47%, while care proceedings, which is when social services apply to a court for a child to be taken into care, have gone up 64%. And the number of children ending up in care has increased by 13%. Ray Jones reports regularly to the Children's Minister, and this is what he's been telling him.
Often the councils put in some more resources, money, by taking money from elsewhere, finding it increasingly difficult to do that because of the public sector expenditure cuts. But they're all doing it in a context where they're struggling to keep up with the demand coming through the front door. They can't recruit enough social workers who will be staying around to make sure they know those families who they need to know well.
Is the Children's Minister listening?
The Minister replies to me in terms of thanking me for my letters. I appreciate that you'll have read the letter and the civil servants will have read the letter. But do I see it getting better on the ground? No, I see increasing poverty for families. I see increasing pressure and difficulty of coping with workloads for social workers and police officers and paediatricians, and I see nothing at the moment which suggests to me that it's going to get better rather than worse.
According to the NSPCC, it's a recurring theme of child abuse cases that people notice something's wrong but shy away from getting involved. Why do you think it is that people don't come forward?
it's a lack of confidence, a kind of reticence about getting involved into someone else's business, I suppose. It's quite a big thing to comment on what another person's child might be experiencing, and yet if you have the courage to speak up, you could be saving a child's life.
Daniel Pelka will not be the only little boy to die as a result of abuse this year. More than 50 children are likely to be killed by those meant to be caring for them.
Well, watching that with me in the studio is Ray Jones, who you saw in that film. Also, we have Dame Claire Tickell, the Chief Executive of the children's charity Action for Children, and Councillor David Simmons, Chair of the Local Government Association's Children and Young People Board. Thank you all very much for being with us. Ray, if I may start with you. Kira Ishak, Victoria Colombier, Baby P, Peter Connolly, let's not forget his name. How many times are we going to have these same soul-destroying conversations?
Well, we've had them a lot over the last 40 years now. We can go all the way back, if we want, to 1973. And the first big story then was about a little girl called Maria Colwell in Brighton. And every year about 50 to 70 children are dying in England as a consequence of neglect or abuse by their carers. So it's there every day for the people who are doing child protection. It only hits the public attention from time to time, but I'm afraid it's the working experience of people trying to protect children that sometimes they're not able to do so.
The thing is, we are promised so much when a high-profile case takes place, and post-Baby P and all of the attention that was diverted, we were assured that problems had been fixed. We were assured that there would be early intervention. What happened with that?
Well, I mean, it's not an unremittingly grim story. There have been some improvements across the system, but we have a real worry about what's happening on early intervention. Eileen Munro made a very clear recommendation in her very good report that a duty should be introduced for local authorities on early intervention, and that wasn't followed up by the government. It was actually, the recommendation was also supported by the Select Committee that reported last year. We think that was a huge missed opportunity, and as Ray said, at a time when resources are incredibly tight and local authorities are having to cut back and need is going up, there needs to be something positive in place to help local authorities to commission services specifically for early intervention, because just under 40% of children in different parts of the UK will present and are first registered for child protection purposes because of neglect, and we know that we can make a huge difference in the lives of children if we can intervene early enough.
Right, I mean you just mentioned funding there, but I'm just looking at the number of interventions that took place in this case. January 2011, Daniel has a broken arm. February 2011, fails to turn up for a follow-up appointment. March 2011, police visit the home. June 2011, social services close the file. July 2011, a health worker visit. I'm not even halfway through this list. There were plenty of people involved in this. There didn't seem to be a want of personnel. There was a want of action, David Simmons.
You're absolutely right. Mums and dads up and down the country will be looking at the coverage of this appalling case and thinking, how could this go on in a family without it being noticed and without it being stopped? I think you're absolutely right to highlight funding.
They won't be asking why wasn't it noticed. It was noticed by a number of people.
Which we also need to recognise is, as well as the resources in the system to deal with the very large increase in the number of children who are needing help, we also need to make sure that there's a real shared culture of responsibility among councils, among schools,
with respect,
and police, and so on, working together to sort this out.
I think everybody will accept that we all should be working together to stop children being killed by those who wish them harm. What people will want to know is why, on these 11 interactions with police, with teachers, with healthcare professionals, did nobody yank that child out of that hell and save his life?
And in the areas of the country where this is working well, somebody would have done, quite possibly the very first time that child came through the door of a children's centre or GP surgery, somebody would have said, something is wrong here and I'm going to deal with it. The issue that we have is we're not, as a country, consistently as good at this as we need to be. There are some parts of the country where the system is creaking and is not working effectively, and it needs to be better.
All right, OK, Ray, you look at the places it's not working. Where is it not working? Why is it not working now?
Well, I think that, to be honest, it's not working as well as we want anywhere. And my reason for saying that is I'm not sure that what was known about Daniel at the time, in a lot of places, would have triggered an urgent response to take action on his behalf. And what we now know, we know through the criminal trial and through drilling down on what was happening for Daniel and his family as one case when we know that her child had died. I'm not sure how much Daniel actually stood out, this is terrible to say this, but stood out from other children within that school or whatever.
But that's a devastating thing to say about a boy who was picking refuse out of a dustbin because he was starving. You're telling me that there are other children doing that who are not going through abuse?
Well, I'm telling you that within that school, I would suspect, although I don't know, that there were other children who were coming to school who were hungry. There were children coming to school who didn't have all the clothing that they needed. And Daniel wasn't coming from a family that was suffering severe deprivation and poverty, but there would have been other children who were. And as a consequence of that, two things. One is that he may not have stood out quite as much as we now think that he does in terms of how the story is told at this point in time. Secondly, even if the school did see that Daniel was in a special situation that needed urgent action, getting that urgent action taken by social services and police officers who already are up to their neck dealing with even more urgent actions for children who are in immediate danger, sometimes schools can't get the response that they need.
Well, let's talk about schools, because we heard one of the teachers break down while giving evidence, and of course it is an awful thing. You saw a child reduce and reduce and reduce, and you now know that child is no longer with us. What's going on at the school level, at the teacher level? Why isn't there a clearer shout that goes out from the classroom?
It's really difficult talking about this particular case.
Let's talk in more generalised
But
terms.
I do think that there are huge issues for teachers in many of the ways that Ray says. I think also we did some research a couple of years ago where we asked non-social care professionals about how confident they felt in intervening in cases of neglect. And actually what was really interesting was something like 40% were coming back and saying they didn't know quite what to do with it. They weren't quite sure that it would be escalated up sufficiently. And actually about 44% of the teachers very specifically said they didn't know what to do when they were finding resistance from parents, because they didn't necessarily feel that they had the skills or the authority or the links with other professionals to do something about it. And that, I think, is a real concern,
David,
because there's a huge amount of pressure now being put on teachers,
David,
because of the cutbacks that we're talking about.
That falls in your lap in that case.
Very much so. I think from a council perspective, the key things we're seeking to do, firstly, is to make sure that we have a balance of staff with both the quality but the experience to pick up these issues. And then secondly, at the social services end that Ray's talked about, where matters are brought to our attention, we deal with them quickly. And I've spoken to head teachers who've described to me children coming to school who perhaps haven't had breakfast. If it happens once, then they may not be too concerned. But if it's happening every day, then that would trigger further inquiries, which we would then investigate.
You're saying it's a general feeling. A general feeling happens over time. It means that there is a systemic failure which surely you look to David to sort out.
I'm saying that there is certainly, of the teachers that we spoke to, that was a very striking finding.
Okay, well then deal with that. This is a general impression. This is not a few teachers who are saying we didn't know what to do. This is a pervasive feeling we're hearing from Claire Tickell.
And it is a consistent issue that's come up in a number of different child protection cases, and indeed in many of the very serious cases that you described.
So what's going wrong? Is it the training that you're giving to your staff?
It's a combination of factors. Is it the confidence
that you're giving to your staff? What is it?
I think it's a combination of factors. Schools are autonomous organisations. They're largely responsible for what goes on behind their own doors. The key thing is to make sure, firstly, that teachers, when they're trained, when they first come into the classroom, right through their careers, are able to deal with these kind of issues when they come forward.
In this case, the teacher did take it further.
They're then dealt with properly.
But yes, well, let's deal with it just very briefly, the dealing with it further, because the teachers did make a noise about this. Teachers are making a noise about it. It gets lost then in some kind of labyrinth afterwards. What needs to be done to sort that out?
Well, let's look at the system in context. We have one of the best child protection systems in the developed world, but this is one of the things that keeps coming up as a problem. And I think there are a couple of things that we can do that will help to fix it, because we need firstly to understand the detail. Serious case review will show what went wrong and at what particular points.
We'll look at the serious.
We need to identify the
serious
actions we will
case review.
take
But you have the ear of the minister. What do you want him to do? If he's listening to you right now, what do you want him to do right now?
I'm not sure I have the ear of the minister, and I do realise that politics is a difficult job as well. But what I am concerned about is the increasing difficulty that some parents are having parenting well. Not malicious parents like Daniel's parents, but parents who are becoming more and more poor, more and more destitute, and just can't do what they want to do for their children. Secondly, I'm concerned about the blame culture. And we've heard today from the local MP in Coventry the demand that people lose their jobs. That's not helpful. And these are dedicated people doing a really difficult job in distressing circumstances. We need more of them, not less of them. And to take people off the pitch when they're very experienced is not a good idea, actually.
OK. Well, thank you all very much. We'll leave it there. The standoff... Well, they turned Daniel from a beautiful, bright-eyed little boy into a bag of bones. They basically broke him in so many ways. The words of a senior officer responsible for the investigation into 4-year-old Daniel Pelka's death. Today, the Deputy Prime Minister, Newsnight, talks to a man who advises the government where the failures in our social care system lie, the system that's supposed to protect the most vulnerable children. And his prognosis is worrying indeed. Zoe Conway has this report.
He was starved, he was beaten on.
Said the horrific catalogue of abuse should be on everyone's conscience. This was a little boy who went to school after all, even as he was being starved, force-fed salt, beaten, held underwater in his bath and locked in a cold, empty room for days on end.
Daniel Pelka's suffering, or of disbelief that so many opportunities were missed to intervene. In the 14 months before his death, there were visits to his home by social workers, health workers and teachers. There was a police investigation, and just 3 weeks before he died,
on a regular basis. He was imprisoned in a box room. He was drowned to a point of unconsciousness on occasion, and also he was poisoned with salt. So yes, an absolutely wretched existence for this little boy.
There's no shortage of horrifying descriptions of